As I was saying a little bit earlier, if you live long enough, you become history. And in spite of the fact that I feel very unrelic-like, you have to embrace, the passage of time. And it seems very strange to me to have 30-year-old men and women coming up to me talking about how they saw Star Wars when they were 6 or whatever, and how much they enjoyed it. I live here in Prescott. I've been here 32 years. Hollywood prompted my move to Prescott. It wasn't Star Wars, it was Star Trek. But that's another story. Here's a copy of the first edition. I wish I had 100 of these. It's funny, it's like my wife comes from a very small town in Texas, very poor family, but she's very conscious of her heritage. And when we moved to Prescott, she gathered up as much of the old farming equipment as she could, and that's now our den decor. And when her mother came out there, her mother was elderly, Joanne was a late child, she looked at all this stuff and said, "Why is all this junk in your house?" Well, this plow is now a valuable antique, and this set of brands is now part of the history of Texas. But to her, it was just stuff that she lived with. Well, to me, this was just stuff that I lived with. I will tell you the story behind Splinter the Mind's Eye and how it came to be. It's a short story. A long time ago, in a city not so far away, a fellow named George Lucas was trying to make a science fiction film that everybody was convinced would be a complete flop. He went first to Universal Studios for financing because he had made a very successful film for Universal Studios. Anybody know what that might be? American Graffiti. Made on a very low budget, made a great deal of money, made the reputation of a lot of young actors. And so naturally, when George needed financing for this science fiction film he wanted to make, he went to Universal, and Universal turned it down. He said, "Nobody wants to see this stuff. Nobody goes to science fiction films. There's no giant bugs in it." So George knew Alan Ladd Jr., who at that time was running 20th Century Fox. And they made a deal. And lo and behold, George had his financing and just barely managed to get enough money to actually make the movie. He needed more, but he did the best he could with what he was given. And George is a very smart guy. He doesn't look like it necessarily. He doesn't look like everybody's version of what a great Hollywood director should be. If there were 100 people in the room, he'd probably be the last person you'd pick to actually be George Lucas if you'd never seen a picture of him. He's the nicest guy I ever met in the film business. I met a lot of people in the film business. He's probably too nice to be in the film business, but that's the way things worked out because he loves movies. So George is making the film, and as I said, he's a smart guy, and he's a student, no doubt, of Walt Disney. Walt Disney was the first filmmaker to realize there was a lot of money to be made selling things that were associated with the movies that he was making that had nothing to do with movies, whether they were watches or train sets or anything else. Well, George realized this, so he started making plans to hopefully, if the film made any money at all, exploit the ancillary rights to the film, selling things like toys and t-shirts and baseball caps and books and comic books. 20th Century Fox, of course, hoped the film would make some money, but they really had no interest in spin-offs because at that time, spin-offs, ancillary rights didn't make much money, and certainly this little science fiction film wasn't going to. So George, in the contract, specified that he would keep all of the merchandising rights. So George, even though he didn't get paid a whole lot to direct and write the movie, kept all the merchandising rights. Now you think about how much money that represents now through the years, and basically if you want, you go and buy your own country. What George did, since he doesn't like Hollywood, he didn't move to Prescott, he moved to a place called San Anselmo, north of San Francisco, and built his own studio. In fact, the first thing he did after Star Wars became a bona fide runaway success was quit both the Directors Guild and the Writers Guild. That's what George Lucas thinks of traditional Hollywood filmmaking. As I mentioned, one of the ancillary rights that George kept was the book rights. While the film was in production, he thought that it would be a good idea to have something come out before the film came out to kind of prepare the ground for people who had no idea what Star Wars was. It was called The Star Wars, by the way, at the time. If you ever see a T-shirt with a little triangular piece of art on it, that's the first piece of artwork that Ralph McQuarrie, who became the production designer for all the Star Wars films, did. It says The Star Wars. Buy it. You see it at a garage sale or something, by all means pick it up. So it was called The Star Wars at the time, and it changed to Star Wars while I was still there. But this was while the film was still well into production. And George wanted a book version of the film to come out, a novelization, and also wanted some kind of a sequel to come out, so that if the film did prove moderately successful, there would be more material for people before he could make, say, a second film, which he always had in mind. So he put out the word that the rights to this film were available. They were purchased by a very remarkable woman named Judy Lynn Del Rey, who at that time was the editor of Ballantine Books' science fiction line, which became Del Rey Books, named after her, and her husband, the writer Lester Del Rey. But Judy Lynn was a dwarf. She stood about this tall. She eventually became a vice president of Random House, died too young. An astonishing woman, full of life and vitality and more brains than most people had, and most people tended to underestimate her because of her size, which she used to her advantage. Not her size, the underestimation. I once watched her take apart a lawyer for 20th Century Fox on the 20th Century Fox lot, talking about contracts regarding Star Trek. It was wonderful to see. I wish I could have filmed it. But she just piece by piece demolished every argument this man had. So George needed somebody to write the book version of the film and a sequel book. And the word went out. Del Rey, Ballantine bought the rights. What happens when a publisher buys the rights to do a book version of a movie is the publisher then goes and picks a writer to do the work. The writer is then presented to the film company, the production company, whoever's selling the rights, and based on their approval, the writer is then given a copy of the screenplay. Usually that's all, not always, but usually. And, is then sent to write the book. But George wanted both a novelization of the film and a sequel book. So it was a two-book contract. Someone had read a book, I still to this day don't know how. Someone had read a book of mine called Icebreaker, which was my third original novel, and felt that it was similar in spirit to the movie that George was making, and that I, having already done a fair number of movie novelizations, might be the suitable person to do this. So I was contacted, my publisher proposed me as the writer, and I then went to meet with Tom Pollock, who later became either vice president or president of Universal Studios, but at that time was George Lucas's lawyer. He was an entertainment lawyer working out of an office on Sunset Boulevard. I apparently passed that brief interview. He said, okay, we'd like you to go meet with George. If you're okay with George, then we'll give you the contract and you can go to work. So I was sent out to Industrial Light and Magic, which is a name you probably are all familiar with by now. Well, at that time, Industrial Light and Magic, instead of being a giant of the special effects industry, occupied a rented warehouse on Kester Avenue in Van Nuys, which is in the San Fernando Valley, and by sheer coincidence was about a 6-minute drive from where I grew up. So I knew the street. I didn't know the building, but I knew exactly where it was. So I went out there on one nice sunny day and parked, and in the parking lot of this warehouse were these huge plywood tables, at least as long as these tables in here, completely covered with these little plastic things that looked like buildings. I didn't find out later, this was the original trench for the Death Star shot at the end, where Luke goes down the trench, and move the camera down. It was so big they couldn't fit it inside the building. And I went in, and one whole wall on one side of this warehouse, which was a higher wall than this, was completely covered with cannibalized Revell model kits from things like World War II battleships and World War II planes. These were all the parts they used to build the ships, the TIE fighters, the Death Star surface, everything else. And all these people sitting around busily, happily making things out of these cannibalized model kits. I was introduced to John Dykstra, who I was told was the director of photography, and George was busy at that time, and John said, "Come here, I want to show you something, I want to show you something." We go into a back room, it's a dark room. Sitting on a pylon is the original Millennium Falcon, which is a big model, with a green screen behind it. And John is showing me this camera and trying to explain to me, this is the first computer-controlled camera in the history of film. Now you have to remember when Star Wars was made, this is early 70s. Anything to do with computers, never mind computer-controlled motion picture cameras, was very new. Dykstra had built this thing from scratch and said, with this camera we can go around the model, we can go over the model, and he was like a kid with a toy. And that was the main thing that struck me about visiting and talking to all the people who were working at Industrial Light and Magic. They were all kids with toys. They were all having a great time. The fact that they were making a movie seemed to be incidental to the joy they were taking from just playing around with all this great stuff. So George comes out and we shake hands, and, how are you? And he's obviously fairly preoccupied because he's trying to finish this film before he runs out of money. And we talk a little bit, and he said, "Come here, I want to show you something." And he's just another kid with toys, except he got all the toys. And like, here's the Death Star, which is about this big. And, of course, I never had the sense to say, well, when you're finished with the movie, George, if you don't want to hold on to any of these things, can I have them? But nobody thinks to do those things. Nobody thinks to do those things. So George was happy with me, and I was happy with George. And I remember asking him, trying to make conversation with somebody that I had just met. I said, George, if this film doesn't make it, will you be all right? He said, yeah, I'll be okay. He had enough money from American Graffiti residuals, he thought he'd be fine for the rest of his life. I said, well, if it's a big success, what are you going to do? He said, I'd like to make small experimental movies. And in an interview with, I think it was Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes a few years ago, she asked him that question, what do you want to do now? He said, I want to make small experimental movies. So he's been sidetracked for a number of decades. He's just made large experimental movies, that's all. And anyway, I was given the job. So I got a copy of the screenplay, which along with a bunch of other stuff is, if anyone is ever curious to see it, is in the Special Collections department of the Hayden Library at ASU. That's where all my papers are. You can go see these things. There's a copy of the original screenplay, and there's one from Alien and one from a bunch of other films that I novelized. My wife, of course, now says, you really should have hung on to those. We could probably get a couple of dollars for those. No, I said, we've done all right out of this. It's better off if it's there and people can go and look at it and it's not sitting in somebody's collection in Massachusetts or something. So I wrote the screenplay, and as I'm writing, I wrote the book, and as I'm writing the book, I'm going through the screenplay, and I'm thinking, he can't afford to put this on screen this way. He can't afford to put this on screen this way. And then I started in on Splinter, and I had no guidelines for Splinter. I said, well, what do you want in your sequel novel, George? And he said, I don't care, do anything you want involving the characters and the story that I've set up, the background that I've set up. He said, you can do anything you want. Basically, he didn't have time to mess with it anyway. So I had complete freedom to write the book with one exception. He said, you can't use the character of Han Solo, because at that time, Harrison Ford had not yet signed on for any sequels or for the use of his likeness or anything else to do with Star Wars. So that's why Han Solo does not appear in Splinter the Mind's Eye. It's also why Ralph McQuarrie painted the cover this way. It turned out to be an extraordinarily dramatic and successful cover. But there was a specific reason he had to paint it this way. He said,